Good morning. My name is Lance French. I'm the Business Development Manager for Braun Intertec, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on SPCC plans, protecting your inventory and managing your liability. Our experts today are Jill Mickelson, professional engineer, and Josh, I'm going to say it, Cardamus. He's also a professional engineer. Thank you for joining us today, you two.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please send them to me through your questions tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your questions right away, I'll make sure Jill and Josh see them and we will get an answer to you as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar and it will be available to rewatch on our website soon along with the slides. And I'm going to send you an email with a link when they are made available. So Jill, I think you are the lucky winner of starting us off, so take it away.
All right, thanks, Lance. So hi, everyone. Jill Mickelson here. We'll go through our agenda for our talk today, and then we'll get into some introductions. So first on our agenda, we'll go and do an overview of who we are and why we think we are qualified to talk to you about this topic. Then we'll get into part one of our talk, which is a basic introduction to the SPCC plan and the overall goals of this important piece of federal legislation. And then in part two, we'll talk about different strategies for optimizing the SPCC plan, which is in of itself a fairly bulky, unwieldy, and honestly somewhat confusing and complicated set of regulations. So we'll help you clarify ownership and responsibility. We'll talk about how to optimize your facility. We'll clue in on some important maintenance tasks that you can take to reduce costs and liability. We'll talk about the importance of inspections, and then we'll circle back at the end with some tips for training and make sure that we've got your folks, your staff, equipped to make the right decisions to protect your facility from accidental releases. And then lastly, we will end our session with some questions, comments, feedback. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and Lance will help us address those at the end. So Braun Intertec. So W&M is an important partner of Braun Intertec. We are all one big, I would say, happy family. We are one big company. Braun Intertec was founded in 1957, and we currently employ over 1,000 engineers, geologists, industrial hygienists, scientists, and other technical specialists across our company. In many cases, we have multiple specialties located within each office, and we all network with each other, so we know who each other are, we know how to get resources available. While our coverage stretches from as far north as Minnesota and North Dakota, which is where Josh and I hail from, we do basically specialize in what we like to call the flyover states, right? Down to Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, a lot of offices in Texas and even Louisiana. And our thoughts go out to those, by the way, in Texas, Louisiana, who are getting hammered by Hurricane Laura right now. As a benefit, our company is 100% employee owned. Every single employee of Braun Intertec is an employee owner. And that makes a difference because we're out there working hard for each other. We're working hard for our clients. We're not working towards for some mysterious a third-party owner or stock market index fund.
So I'm Josh Cattermas. I've got 21 years of experience in environmental consulting. I'm registered as a professional engineer in North Dakota, Minnesota, and Missouri. I've actually worked in 10 different states across the country and 3 EPA regions, including a project in Mexico. I've ranged in working on storage and production facilities out in the oil patch, as well as general industry, permit compliance, as well as construction support, addressing permitting and cleanup issues as they are encountered during construction. So I started out in cleaning up spills, moved over into the pre-spill compliance stuff, and then actually now I do kind of a split of both. So I'm well aware of the order of magnitude savings that a penny of investment can save a pound of cure. And then here's if you see me on site during COVID, I'm suited up on construction sites as needed.
And I'm Jill Michelson. I have 25 years of experience in the environmental consulting industry and also a professional engineer licensed in North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And I can't boast 10 states worth of experience like you can, Josh. I do have some unique experience in what I'll call large project construction. I do a lot of work on large infrastructure, bridges and dams, things that have a big footprint in the environment. And I work on what we call alternative delivery projects. So design, build, or construction manager, general contractor, types of projects where contractors take on more risk. And when they take on more risk, they take on more environmental risk. And because of that, they employ environmental management systems on the construction site in order to reduce that risk. And that has been my specialty probably for the last 10, 13 years. I was focusing on regulatory compliance and permitting as it pertains to large construction sites and different industrial facilities. And basically trying to protect the environment from the construction site, yes, but also trying to help optimize the construction or the facility so that they are less impacted by environmental regulations. And yeah, we, as Josh mentioned, we're office and we're field people. We're boots to suits, really. And if you see me in the field, there's not a lot of, we're really these days in COVID, we're not showing a lot of skin, which is why I like to have my name on my hard hat. So if you see me in the field, you'll either go, yay, it's Jill Michelson, or more likely, you're probably going to say, oh no, it's Jill Michelson. What's she here for? So the SPCC plan. The SPCC stands for Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasures. In short, it is a federal requirement that applies to all facilities that store more than 1,320 gallons of oil in above ground tanks and storage containers. Note that if you have more than 10,000 gallons, your SPCC plan has to be prepared and signed by a professional engineer. The benefit of a professional engineer in helping you evaluate your facility and prepare the plan is that we have a very good understanding of what they mean by good engineering practice, which basically allows us to use our professional judgment and use engineering equivalents for some of these fairly strict oil protection, storage, and containment and spill response measures. So really the SPCC plan itself has two goals: spill prevention of oil containing materials, and then emergency response, which is really where the control and countermeasure parts of the plan come in.
Right, and so again, the spill prevention is the goal, but we understand that that is the materials that you paid for and need to run your business. So we understand that, you have no interest in having spills either, because that's lost revenue for your facility. So we understand that, and we work creatively to navigate those regulations in a means that works efficiently for you.
So what are the types of oil products that are regulated by the federal SPCC rule? So basically, it's an oil-containing product. And this may be oils like fats, oils or greases produced by the food industry, nut oils, butter, anything that could be liquid at room temperature or at a reasonably expected temperature, such as a hot day in Texas. Your typical petroleum, diesel, gas, fuel oil, those types of petroleum products, mineral oils, hydraulic fluids, which may be present in reservoirs and certain types of equipment or processing equipment, waste oils, so used oils. There's a lot of inks that are oil-based, whether they're based in linseed oil or a petroleum oil. It doesn't matter, it's still regulated by the SPCC rules. And then we have other oil mixtures, including products that may have started off when they were new as not containing oil, but because of some use, and I'm thinking, antifreeze, exposure to perhaps cracks in a crankcase, may have become cross-contaminated and have oil as a result of being used. Those are also regulated under the federal SPCC rule.
So in addition to that, some things that are not SPCC oils are things that are not fluid at room or atmospheric temperatures. Hot mix asphalt during those temperatures is generally more a rock than it is a flowable fluid. So that has been recently eliminated from regulation.
Now, the types of industries that are regulated under the SPCC rules are, well, basically everything. Manufacturing facilities, newspaper, magazine printing facilities, we have fleet maintenance facilities, have a lot of fueling trucks, airports with their storage of different aviation gas, also maintenance fluids, petroleum storage, bulk storage facilities, as well as, petroleum production facilities, power plants, especially ones that have backup power systems. Those generators often house belly tanks with thousands of gallons of fuel in them. And then even the ag industry and farms are no longer exempt from having SPCC rules. It's an important, one primary purpose or one outcome of the SPCC plan preparation is that we really focus on prevention. As Josh mentioned, prevention not only protects your investment in your materials, it protects the environment, and it's way less costly than the amount of money that you spend if you have a large-scale emergency response. So really, as we walk folks through the SPCC plan preparation, we're working with the owners to identify what are your at-risk storage containers. You have to do a comprehensive inventory of your entire facility. We also want to make sure that we're keying in on the storage containers that may be in at-risk situations, whether they're close to a floor drain or close to a stormwater receptor and may not have adequate containment. And we also want to make sure that we are protecting both our tanks from damage during delivery and our surface waters from accidental releases. And then we want to make sure that all our folks are aware and on board and aware we have a plan for spill emergencies and that we've trained the staff on site on how to appropriately respond in case of an emergency. So specific to the federal rules, and your states may have other requirements, but the federal rules consider an at-risk storage container to be anything that is 55 gallons or greater in volume. And this is the tank listed volume. This is not the volume that you actually have in the tank. This is what the stated volume of the tank is. And this is usually contained on a plate on the side of the tank. Or if you're unsure, you can always use your tape measure and get a good estimate. So anything 55 gallons or greater on your facility has to be inventoried and the total counted. And then we see if we've reached that 1,320 gallon or the higher threshold of 10,000 gallons of storage on your site. We're looking at tanks. We're looking at portable totes. We're looking at your drums. And then we're also looking at oil-filled equipment, whether it's something on a processing line that has a hydraulic fluid reservoir that's 55 gallons or greater, or elevators. If you're in a SPCC regulated facility, your elevators often will have a hydraulic fluid reservoir that is over 55 gallons, and all of a sudden they become a regulated tank. And the last thing that you can look at is if you have equipment like excavators or again that have these hydraulic fluid containers. In the oil production sphere, you're going to see a lot of storage, regulated storage. On the far right, you can see large, they call them emergency storage tanks or surge tanks that are connected together at the top for overflows. You can see, you know, emulsion treaters or separators, these flow-through tanks where the product is coming in one end and exiting the other. You have condensate tanks, which I don't know that are shown on this, but basically where you're stripping oil products out of a natural gases that are also being removed during production. And then it's important to talk about produced water, because when oil is collected from underneath the ground, it doesn't come out as just pure crude. It comes out as a combination of basically a saline or a salt water, a brine, mixed with oil. In a lot of cases, what we also have to store that material, and that is considered an oil mixture, and it is also regulated under the SPCC rules. It is often that brine will eventually often be re-injected into the ground, but again, until it's re-injected, it is ours to safely store and be prepared to manage spills or releases. So SPCC plans, they do not apply to something like a water truck. This is a vehicle where, yes, it has petroleum, but petroleum is used to move the vehicle. We call that a motive power container. That does not count for SPCC rules, and neither does the water tank on the back of the truck. Fuel containers that are much smaller than 55 gallons, absolutely exempt. Something like a propane or a natural gas container, where if punctured, the release would be to the atmosphere, not to the ground, doesn't count. Underground storage tanks. Unless your underground storage tank volume is 42,000 gallons or more, the SPCC rule does not apply. The SPCC rule, again, focuses on things that are above ground and the piping that connects them. Underground storage tanks are already adequately regulated by your states and other programs. And then there are containers that we consider. I would consider these tanks, drums, to have been permanently taken out of service, is the term we call. Converted tanks that no longer hold fuel and are no longer capable of holding fuel. You may argue if they're terribly comfortable, but I can definitely tell you that this set of deck furniture is no longer regulated by the SPCC rule.
That's good to know, because we use those for smoking meats down here in Texas. So.
Yes, yeah, well, I mean, get it plenty clean, Lance, but absolutely don't regulate it.
Okay, fine, but.
Also, invite me over the next time you make brisket, please. So moving on. So an important part of the SPCC rule is, of course, preventing spills. We're going to do this in a variety of ways through a plan. One way is through inventory management. You know, making sure that we've got a complete list of what we have stored on site. Make sure that we're focusing on the containers that are 55 gallons or more. And then making sure that we have the right containment. For most oil storage, either in tanks or in portable containers or in drums, you're required to provide secondary containment equal to the volume of the single largest container in that containment area. So you could have a mixture of 55-gallon drums and perhaps a couple of 500-gallon totes. The amount of containment that you need in that area is the size equal to the largest size, so that 500-gallon tote. Now, if you're outdoors, you also have to include some accommodations of extra volume for precipitation. The other thing we do to help in prevention of spills is we have to look at our runoff control. Figure out where you have your materials stored or in use, and then figure out where are they going to go in the case of a release or a spill. Is it a floor drain? Is it a surface stormwater inlet? You have to inventory and be aware of where these key receptors are on your facility. The other thing that we do for prevention is it's required to have a regular inspection program of your tanks, your dispensers, of the supports that support your tanks and promote their integrity, and also of piping that may connect them. The inspections have to occur regularly. There's also an annual inspection that has to occur. And you have to make sure that your staff are trained so that they can correctly perform the inspections and they can correctly identify when there are issues that have to be fixed so that they can get those reported up the chain of command to get things addressed. And the last thing that's important for prevention is to optimize. There's no need for you to have extra tanks or a process that leads to the more petroleum use if we can come up or work with you to come up with a way that's better. This is then going to reduce your risk exposure and lead to prevention of spills. And that's really the focus of the second half of our talk today. Emergency response. Again, we talk about training your folks to make sure that they know how to react in an emergency. And not to say that we expect that if you have an SPCC plan or developing one, that you have to have a flow chart memorized. Really, you want your folks to be able to focus on what are the first 3 right actions that I have to take. And then maybe have a flow chart here to help guide them through further steps. Or if you have people who are on the ground, make sure that they know the very simple reactions that they're supposed to have. Simple things like turn off the sources of the fuel, right? Protect inlets, or use a shovel to dike or berm spills from getting anywhere, and then make sure that they're notifying, the floor manager or whoever it is that's on site. And then make sure that that floor manager knows, using a flow chart or the sometimes included in an SPCC plan, what's the right next step that I have to make. It's just important that you figure this out ahead of time so that you've got your training in place, you've got your communication protocols figured out, you have the adequate spill materials on hand, that if you have a lot of volume on your facility, maybe you've arranged to have relationships with spill responders in advance, or at the very least, you know how to use a phone book, or you have contact information for the folks who are commonly on call in your area. And then know the thresholds, both your state notification thresholds and the federal thresholds for spill response. All states handle spill response differently. Most have a dedicated notification line. Many of those are toll-free. But also be aware that under the federal SPCC rules, if you have a release that gets into a water body, that if you have more than 42 gallons actually get into the water body, you have some federal reporting requirements as well. So the SPCC plan itself can be a physical paper document. In some cases, it may look like a kind of a large plan sheet that you hang on your wall. Whatever form that it's in, it has to be kept on site. Or if the site is not attended, it may be available at a management office within a certain amount of time if the feds come asking for it. The other way that you can maintain an SPCC plan is if you have an environmental management system or an EMS. These come into play in ISO 14001 facilities, where all of your documents and your records management are handled electronically. That is also an acceptable way for an SPCC plan to be kept. An SPCC plan, especially one that has 10,000 gallons or more stored, has to have a PE signature. A professional engineer has to have reviewed and signed and stamped the SPCC plan. Folks who have an SPCC plan are required to review them every 5 years. Although I would encourage you to take the occasion of the required annual training and annual inspection to use that as a time to review your SPCC plan and make changes. And then any records that you retain, that you produce as a result of administering an SPCC plan for your facility, and I'm talking the routine and post-rain event inspection records, these records have to be retained for at least 3 years. So the idea is that if a regulator from the feds comes to your facility and says, I need to have your SPCC plan, you need to be able to produce it. And then you need to be able to produce the inspection records and the training records and all the other records for the last 3 years. And I know Josh has joked in the past that the other thing they do, well, you want to say it? It's good.
So you want to make sure that the people on staff are familiar and actually use the spill plan, because the regulator's going to ask to see it. They're going to, first thing they do is they're going to measure the layer of dust that's on top of the plan, and then they're going to start going through your paperwork. So it's important that the people on site know it and use it so that it can be helpful to them.
Hey, Josh and Jill, we have just a quick question from the audience. How many SPC plans have y'all written?
I've lost track. I've done them for individual farmsteads, for $250,000 million gallon facilities, everything from individual construction sites to facilities to oil production facilities, and then all the way down to USDA technical service provider SPCC plans for individual farmsteads. So quite a range.
Yeah, I don't know. It's Thursday, right? So I think I'm reduced to counting on fingers and toes by the end of the week. But I do know. Well, it gets to be a lot, especially in the oil production arena, when we get a new producer who moves in and buys a bunch of old wells and has to do their own SPCC plans, and all of a sudden we get handed a portfolio and say, here, we need SPCC plans for 35 or 70 or whatever different sites. It gets to be a lot.
And again, the goal is making sure that you can pull the plan that was previously employed at the facility, but you want to make it your own plan. So we really work on making sure that it works in with your existing operations. So it doesn't just sit on the shelf and collect dust. It actually gets utilized as a living document. Because that's really how they're effective.
That's the dream, certainly, or the goal. And think of it: if you prepare an SPCC plan, one of us signed it, and then you let it sit on the shelf, you're just making us feel sad. Like all that work we did for you is for nothing. So, don't make me feel sad. Use your plan.
So. Getting into how we optimize the plans. So at your facility, and the first thing you want to do is define the extents of your facility, whether that is the property line, whether that's a fence line, whether that's one building in a strip mall. You want to have a clear definition of what your boundaries of what is under your control. And what you're responsible for. So you could have, privately owned equipment that's on site that has oils in it. You could have temporary contractors that are on site doing a project, and they have fuels or petroleum-based construction materials. You could have individual tenants across a site that have different options, similar to like a tank farm. Or you may be the landowner that's in charge of corralling all the cats in the process. It's important to know not only what's yours, what's theirs, what's combined, so that you make sure that it's clearly communicated who's responsible for it. Because ultimately, if it's not defined beforehand, the landowner, as the owner of the deed of the property, can be held liable. So again, utility owners own transformers. These are often filled with mineral oil, but the process of running the transformer can also generate PCBs in those materials, which is a carcinogen that is common with electrical equipment. If you have transformers on your site, there should be a clear label identifying who owns that transformer, if you own it or if the utility owns it. As well as the volume of oil that's inside it, if there is oil. And there should also be either PCB or non-PCB sticker somewhere on the outside of the structure, so that people know that if there's something leaking out of it, they can respond appropriately. So you want to have that information in the event that you discover that transformer is leaking, has some problems, or if somebody were to accidentally run into it, that you know who to call to address those issues.
Yep, and also on your facility plan, you're going to identify that transformer or that equipment that is not owned or operated by you, that you have no control over. And you're going to make sure that you identify that as such, so that again, if you get inspected, a regulator comes through and sees this and can say, this is not something that, that you are expected to manage, and they won't be digging you for any sins or omissions of another person's piece of equipment.
Yep, and that goes for temporary contractors as well, because if they bring on several barrels of petroleum products on site, that could, one, that's material that has to get managed, but also that could trigger that, now the facility overall has a larger aggregate of volume. So you want to make sure that that contractor has their ducks in a row, that they are that they have their spill plan in place, and that they're managing those materials appropriately, and that it is clearly designated that this is the extent of their responsibilities, and that's not on you. Again, they'll also have to have little nurse tanks to refuel their equipment on site. There's a really good example of a tank in a secondary containment and then on a pallet, so that it can be not only be moved around, but also you can see if there's anything leak underneath it. Tenants and landowners are often, you want to make sure it's clearly designated in the lease or in other documents that shows who's responsible for what. This landowner actually owned this whole block, and the tenant was a auto repair shop. The landowner, we were called outside for doing inspection for a phase 1 environmental site assessment, so that the landowner could use the property as collateral for refinancing another development. We do in our inspection, we find large areas of oil stained soil leaking out of drums or out of dumpsters that were the tenants. We also found in the service pit at the repair shop an oil water separator, which drains to the sanitary sewer system, but has clearly not been serviced in the entire 7 years that the tenant has been in operation. So clearly there was some miscommunication as far as who was responsible for maintaining that, and that it did need to be maintained. What happened here is the bank actually refused to let the landowner use this property as collateral. So it can be some big issues if that communication and that compliance isn't maintained. So in optimize your facility, looking at your facility layout, how your internal equipment and personnel traffic occurs, how your delivery traffic occurs, where materials need to be in order to facilitate your operations, and how can you optimize that so that you can keep track of those materials and make sure that they don't get out of control and cause a release. Balance your security requirements, looking at, do you really need this many and this variety of containers on site? You could see it actually took 2 pictures to cover this hot mess of containers. Granted, they were mostly all on spill pallets, but it just seems like there could be a much more efficient way of managing those materials. And then you look at that lower picture, that was at least 20 drums filled at various levels of fluids. I had to actually crawl over this to actually inventory the tanks or the drums in the back. So clearly these weren't in use, but because they were full of fluid, they still had to be included in the facility's total inventory. And additionally, because they weren't being used, they were largely forgotten about, but just waiting for those drums to rust through and start leaking into the ground or leaking out the back of the building and causing a concern. I actually had a 3,000 cubic yard excavation on a similar facility where the adjacent landowner started complaining about drums leaking under the fence onto their property. And we had to dig out about 30,000 cubic yards of soil and dispose of it at $43 a ton. just to address that issue that was largely a housekeeping issue that got out of hand.
Yeah, when I see something like this, I think, well, the technical term for this is called a hot mess, first of all. But I also look at this and say, you know, this is an opportunity for this facility owner to really optimize their process. A lot of times we may actually be able to help a facility that may be on the cusp of needing an SPCC plan, because like Josh said, you've got maybe dozens of these half-used or unused or no longer used 55-gallon drums on the facility. If we can help folks identify where they don't need to have this anymore and get rid of this, sometimes we can get under that 1,320-gallon threshold, which means that they are then no longer subject to the federal rules, the inspection requirements, the reporting, and you know, can just work on complying with their state regulations.
Yep. So this was the site that I worked on from the initial layout, and you can see a couple different areas of materials that had to be managed internally, but the whole facility, because it had a large amount of truck traffic for deliveries, we used the exterior truck loop, raised that so that everything on site flowed to the center and could be contained in that pond. In addition, both of these containment areas were set into the ground so that trucks could drive into them to load and unload sludges and other materials without compromising the containment system. So again, that was a layout that we we're able to make some efficiencies in the design of the facility and the layout that helped them maintain compliance much more easily. And then because we had multiple different types of materials on site, some SPCC, some regulated under industrial stormwater, we combined all those various inspection protocols into one system of inspections that, again, streamlined the process and alleviate a bunch of headaches for the operations manager. So again, if you're looking at optimizing, it's a balance of cheap does not always mean inexpensive. Depending on how long you need to be on site with those materials, you may trade durability for increased maintenance. What would works for short-term use may, in the long term, be more expensive and much more of a hassle. So you got to factor that maintenance and your labor costs for in those compliance. Secondary containment is a great example of that. An earthen berm is a really inexpensive way to provide containment and quickly construct it, but it does take up an awful lot of space on your property that you have to go over that berm every time you need to get to that tank, either for maintenance or for loading or unloading. It also has quite a bit of a footprint on your site that you can only get vehicles up to it so close. Then it also, because it's just earth, you have a constant maintenance of ensuring that berm doesn't erode or settle. And it may not actually be very effective because it may not protect your groundwater, which if you have a spill, it may get contained in that berm, but you still have to dig down to remove that impacted soil. A wall and liner system, it's more expensive on initial construction, but it has a much less of a footprint, much less maintenance. It's very easy to see if you have maintenance issues. It's very easy to repair them. And then also having a liner, then it contains your fluids inside so they can be recovered rather than having to spend all your money on the excavation. Here's kind of a splitting the difference with a liner system and earthen berm. Again, it doesn't look very pretty, but it does the job. If you're only on site for a couple months, maybe this is the option to go with. But if you're going to be on site for years, that you'll get tired of walking over this berm every time you have to get to that tank, maybe you want to look at a different option.
Hey Josh, there's a bunch. Oh, there's a good one. There's a bunch of questions that says, "What's that white stuff on the ground there?"
This here,
Yeah, what is that?
that
What
is
is that?
snow.
Snow.
That is snow and
Oh,
ice.
gotcha.
To say
Okay.
that's our reality 3/4 of the year up here in the.
Yeah. So
Uh-huh.
that's the fun part about making the regulations meet reality, is that when you have containment systems that are exposed to the elements, you are required to record every time you discharge accumulated precipitation out of that containment system, and that both the volume and the frequency, and that discharge does not have any sheen on it. That is incredibly difficult when the precipitation you're trying to discharge is ice and snow. So some lucky operations person gets to climb into the containment with a shovel and shovel that out, and then you have to figure out how much volume you had and if there's any contamination associated with it.
Yeah, you can find yourself in the position of actually having to have containment for your snow.
Wow.
Right.
If it's
Because you won't be able to see a sheen in this, 3-dimensional volume of snow and dirty snow that's on site.
Yeah. Well, the way
Yeah.
2020 is going, that might be downtown Dallas in October. So.
My 2020 bingo card is kind of crazy right now.
Yeah. So again, take that into consideration when you're deciding containment. An open system maybe work, but maybe you want to invest in, can you bring it undercover so you don't have as much precipitation accumulated inside of it? Can you go with a double wall tank, which all the secondary containment is self-contained within that system? It's weather tight, and you can drive right up to it. Obviously, with a double wall tank, because you can drive right up to it, we recommend putting some bollards or some type of barrier to keep people from driving right up and into and through your tank, because we all have had that employee that is not the stellar employee, but makes mistakes. And while I would not recommend this, we have seen an inflatable kiddie pool used as secondary containment. And technically that does meet the requirements because it was impervious and it had the storage capacity, but maintenance requirements, I can't even imagine, let alone the laughs of people that walk up and see this. So again, as you look at how you optimize your compliance, it's a balance between your cost of your investments and your cost of maintaining that compliance and being able to reduce your environmental risk and future costs. And you can look at it more like this, as each of these red circles here is an individual regulatory element of compliance that you have to meet, and you can do the minimum amounts in each one of those little elements, but keeping them all isolated may actually be more work for your staff or the person managing your facility. You can look at, can we combine these into a more streamlined process with some additional investment and some thought about how can we consolidate our efforts. And then after that point, then you look at, okay, now it's just a balance of how comfortable are we in initial resources versus in investing resources versus reducing your environmental risk. At the very outside end, there's no environmental risk. Everything is secured tight and never leaves its container. But you still have to operate a business, and you still have to make your economic decisions and balance your risk. And that is, we can provide options. Largely, it is a matter of how comfortable you are in rolling the dice with your facility. We try and help find you a solution in that middle ground that you're comfortable with. So I'm going to kind of breeze through a couple of these. Here's some other housekeeping issues. Cleaning up your individual incidental spills, like your dirty dishes in the sink and your laundry, the longer you leave it, the more it builds up. Reusing containers. It's great to reuse containers. Make sure that when you use them, that they are suited for that new use, and that you have relabeled them as well, so that it is clear that these have been repurposed and that they have a different material than what they originally had in them. Don't just load them up and then set them out back, because full containers still have to be listed in your total containment, total capacity volume, and set out back and forgotten about, that is just waiting for them to eventually rust through and create a problem for you in the future. Again, looking at what is a short-term temporary fix, will that create a long-term problem? What's your time window that you plan on being in that facility? If you're only going to be there a couple months, then yeah, silt curtain at your outlet makes sense. If you're going to be there, 10, 15, 20 years, maybe you want something a little more robust. So optimizing your inspections and your testing. Everyone has to defer maintenance at some point, but you want to keep an eye on that, as making sure that deferred maintenance doesn't become a large capital expenditure in the future. There are standards as far as maintenance protocols that EPA generally references as industry standards. Steel Tank Institute's one of them, American Petroleum Institute's another. They apply to both shop-built and field-directed tanks. They have recommendations for a formal inspection of those tanks to ensure that they are still serviceable. You want to avoid this happening. And as you can see here, this is out of the Steel Tank Institute's standard. Category 1 is where you have both a perimeter berm and leak detection underneath the tank. And you can see that you have to get quite a large tank before you have to do a regular integrity inspection to ensure that the wall of that tank is still functional and it hasn't deteriorated. If you only have the berm, you don't have any leak detection underneath it, then you have to be and spend much more time on your inspections of that tank to ensure that that single wall of protection is fully functional. Schedule your inspections when you're already doing a walk around on site. You don't have to set aside a unique time for doing your SPCC inspections included with your regular maintenance or walkthroughs of the day or the month or the year. You want to do every so often. You want to do one that is post-rain events, so you can see how stuff flows on your site and make sure that things are flowing where they're supposed to be and not flowing where they're not supposed to be. Your frequency inspection needs to occur in a time frame that lets you identify an issue before it becomes a problem. I generally recommend at least monthly. Again, you want to identify issues and where things need to be fixed before you have a catastrophic failure, before somebody else is calling and saying why that something needs to be cleaned up.
Yeah, and I've had sites too, Josh, and I'm thinking in particular in production facilities, in some areas where our containment, where we use the judgment of, is your containment sufficiently impervious to be protective and prevent a release? And if the containment is not real impervious, that may be a situation where we recommend a more frequent inspection regime, because you need to have boots on the ground there often enough and looking at things to make sure that you don't get a loss of fuel outside of your containment. So weekly may be too long. It may be, every day or every other day. But we would certainly want to not make that recommendation lightly, and not after we had exhausted other possibilities of maybe upgrading that containment.
Yep. And then optimizing your training. You don't necessarily have to have everyone at your facility have a thorough understanding of everything involved in your SPCC plan. But everyone on site should have a general knowledge that these are the oils that need to be kept out, or that need to be kept in their containers, and that spills are bad. And then they know who to contact if they see something.
Yeah, the SPCC plans are pretty strict. They require an initial training of all your oil handling personnel. So that's as soon as you have an SPCC plan for a facility, you're required to train your oil handling personnel in the appropriate measures. And then as you add personnel to your facility, they are also required to go through this training. So you don't wait for another annual refresher. They have to be trained as soon as they basically become an oil handling personnel on your facility. And then the training has to be refreshed annually. And then we take the annual training as an opportunity to go through and identify any problems that developed in the last year. We talk about failures, failures of containment, maybe a failure in a policy or a failure in an inspection program. We talk about maybe a problematic equipment and what has been cropping up again and again as a maintenance or repair problem. And then we also take the annual training as an opportunity to look at your plan and say, hey, have there been any changes either in staff, critical staff, or in our infrastructure, right, in our storage or in our containment, that mean that we have to change the SPCC plan. And keep in mind, if you have a plan that has been certified by a professional engineer, meaning you have a facility with 10,000 gallons or more, anytime you change the oil handling or the oil storage or containment on your facility, you have to have the PE review the change to the plan or prepare the change to the plan and recertify that document.
Right.
And you want to make sure that this, and you want to make sure that that you're doing this in an effective manner, right, Josh?
Right. Right. Yeah. You don't want this to be your staff during the training. Take an opportunity. Your staff know your facility, and they're dealing with it day to day. We come out there once, and we've seen a whole lot of sites, but we've seen your facility once. And if there is something that we recommend that doesn't work for your facility, or if you got a different idea, we're willing to look at that and come to a solution, because there's a lot of creativity out there that can find a solution that works for everybody, and makes that you can't. Environmental compliance, it is an inconvenience, but there's a reason for it, and we can find a solution that works best for everybody.
All right, now some pro tips from a trainer who's trained hundreds, maybe thousands of people. In your training, do yourself a favor, skip what we call the regulatory babble, okay? The SPCC plans, they do have a certain amount of information that you have to convey by people. It's required by rule. But do yourself and your employees a favor and don't just copy paste into your training, okay? If you have the money and you can pay for someone to prepare training for you, consider it. They know how to deliver it. They know what's important and how to prioritize what your folks need to learn. But skip the regulatory babble, stick to real language, and keep it appropriate and focused on what your folks really need to learn. And then train for the right type of response. Make sure that your issue identification is on point. Train your staff to the actual facility that they inhabit. So use specific examples from your facility. If you're going to have a PowerPoint, use pictures of your own tanks. Use pictures of the surface water that's nearby, or the storm inlet that's located in the middle of the back 40 of your parking lot that takes all the water, right? Be specific. Also be specific in what you want them to do. Say, instead of saying, contact management, say, call this guy or call this number. Make sure that your responses are actionable and appropriate, meaning tell them what to do. We don't need to fill them on what the rule contains, how the rule is written, or the reasons why we have an SPCC rule. We really want to get down to the nitty gritty. Again, we talk about, what are your top 3 things that most people should know? How to stop the release, how to containment, and who to contact next. And then make sure that that contact is the person who knows the full game plan. So we're trying to train your folks to the appropriate level of detail. And we will sometimes, when we run training or when I run training, I will sometimes have like a two-part test or two-part training where we will actually, send most of the people through a very short training, which focuses on, again, short and sweet, what do you need to know? And then we'll send management or other folks maybe through a slightly longer training and get into the who's and the how's and the why's. Again, appropriate level of detail. And then, yeah, use your real life scenarios to game the response. Walk through and say, what if I had a training from this tank? How do we respond? What if I had a release from this line of production equipment? Where would it go? How do we respond? I have known some people who have made contests out of this, Jeopardy style contests, or the ever popular exam. And I know taking tests isn't fun, but if you tell people at the outset of your training that there is going to be exam, I don't even care if it's a simple 10-question exam. They're going to pay attention in a different way than they would if they didn't know that there was going to a test heading their way. All right, well, golly, Josh, I guess we got there.
All right, that's awesome. So we do have a couple of questions, and we are running a little short on time, so I'm going to do a couple of them. If we don't get to the other ones, I will make sure that Jill and Josh get them, and then we answer them to you by email. But one of the questions, can records be kept electronically, or do we need to retain original hard copies?
Electronic is fine as long as they are retrievable to the inspector when they come on site. I believe they have to be produced within 24 hours. Jill, does that sound right?
Yeah, 24 hours is correct. And yes, electronic is fine.
Okay, good. And then is the plan site specific for companies that have smaller sites in other locations? Can they have one plan for all the sites?
Yes and no. You can have the same reporting procedures, the same BMPs across all your sites, and you have just kind of a general, this is how we handle materials at all our sites, but you have to have, a couple page document that is specific to that site of these are the materials that are on this specific site. I've done it where you have just a general operation manual, and then you just have little inserts that are, the site map and a one-page information of, here's the specific materials associated with this site, and then reference back to the general operational plan as far as how those materials are handled.
Excellent.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly what Josh said.
Okay, and then we had a picture earlier of some transformers. Many transformers don't have the appropriate labels. How do you find the information if it isn't labeled?
Check your utility bill and call them. That would be the first person, because it's either operated by the electric utility or it's owned by the facility itself.
And what's this one might be a little bit longer. So, but what are the basic differences between Tier 1 and Tier 2 plans?
Jill, you want to take that one?
And if it's going to be longer, we can also.
Yeah, I was going to say that one might be appropriate for
okay. Well,
later.
Yeah, an email. That sounds good. I think that's.
Yeah, they're basically divided by the size of your facility. If you have 1 million gallons or less, you're able to be a Tier 1. If you're 1 million gallons or more, you're a Tier 2. You do have additional requirements.
Okay. And then last one, there's a couple of them, but last one is, do 55-gallon drums used oil filters count towards the 1,320-gallon threshold?
I would say that there is oil that is dripping out of them and at the bottom of that barrel, and so you have to treat that barrel capacity. You saw that one picture.
Agree.
You saw that one picture I had of a drum that had been modified to allow your filters and stuff to drain out to collect all those fluids. And again, if you're if you're accumulating multiple drums of oil filters, and that that's taking your threshold over the number, then maybe you want to look at, does it make sense to increase the frequency of your waste collections contractor to pick those up?
Yeah, it's the capacity of the container, not the volume of fluid in it. So if the container is a 55-gallon drum, then it is regulated. I would also say that maybe there's an opportunity here. Do you have an unused 35-gallon drum that
Right.
you could use to put your oil filters in? Because sometimes, again, as we're going through a facility, if we see a 55-gallon drum, they need to have a container of about that volume in that location, but it is incredibly difficult to find the proper secondary containment. We may say, hey, can you work with your supplier? Can you get this material or this fluid in a smaller quantity that isn't 55 gallons?
Right.
Excellent. Okay, I'm gonna send Jill and Josh the rest of the questions. There were like 3 or 4 other questions, and there were like 10 other barbecue questions, and I'm gonna answer those on my own. So there's some contact information for Josh and Jill. So if you have any other questions, this was a fantastic webinar. I'm always surprised on how fast that hour goes, but you guys did a fantastic job. Great slides and some great information. So, but if you need to get in contact or have some other questions for Josh and Jill, there's their contact information, and they'll be happy to respond. And I think
Yep,
the
definitely.
next
The next slide
is our next webinar. So we're having a systematic hazardous waste management beyond industrial sectors, and I believe that one's with our expert Daryl Oman, who's done a fantastic job with RECRA across the states, and so we're really excited to have him present to us. So
he's got some interesting stories.
Yes,
yeah,
he does.
I worked with Daryl. He's good people. Yeah, he's been around.
So so thank you guys so much for your time. And I know this takes a lot of time putting together these webinars, but you guys, I can't wait for the next one because you guys were fantastic. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Lance.
All right.
Thanks everyone who attended.
Yeah, and we're going to get these slides out to you guys this afternoon along with the recording. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.